Thank you very much for joining us today. We are excited to present the 19th edition of Energy Evaluation Asia Pacific webinar, featuring expert insights on evaluating energy efficiency and demand response programs, which are critical tools in today's energy transition. My name is Nazir. I'm your host for today's webinar and a coordinator with Energy Evaluation Asia Pacific, which is a vibrant community of energy and evaluation professionals across the Asia Pacific region. Before going to the webinar, I would like to invite you to kindly introduce yourself in the chat, sharing your name, your country, and your organization. I would also like to inform you that we are recording this webinar. Please reach out to us if you have any concern. And one icebreaker question: if you had to assess an energy efficiency program with just one metric, what would it be for you? While you do that, I would like to share with you some housekeeping rules for today's webinar. As I said, this session is being recorded, and we assume that by attending and participating, you give us your consent for this to happen. If you have any concern, please reach out to us. I would like to request you to keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking, but you can switch on your cameras for better engagement. Please use the chat box for questions. The speakers will respond to the questions at the end, where we have a dedicated question and answer session, but they may also respond directly in the chat. Please share your feedback at the end of the session. We will be sharing with you a very brief feedback form. The session will be uploaded on our YouTube channel and as well as on our website. We will be sharing the link for both the YouTube channel and website to you at the end. We will also be sharing with you the session notes on the website as well as through emails. The agenda for today's session looks like this. We will start with welcome remarks and overview of the context from Edward Wine, who is member of the steering committee of Energy Evaluation Asia Pacific. Then we will spend around 30-35 minutes listening to our presenters, Lorenzo Daieff and Teevrat Garg. Then we will have around 15 minutes for moderated audience Q&A session, and we will try to wrap up the session in an hour. Without further ado, let me hand it over to Edward Wine for welcome remarks and context setting. Ed, over to you.
Thank you. Just going to, okay. You can see everything now?
Yes, Ed, we can see your screen.
Great. So these are just some intro slides for today's talk. First, I wanted to introduce Energy Evaluation Asia Pacific. And I know many of you know who we are, but for those who don't, we're not for profit, established in 2018. We're modeled after the US conference called the International Energy Program Evaluation Conference that has been having conferences every 2 years since 1983. And then also in Europe, where we expanded the International Policy and Program Evaluation Conference since 2010. Now it's called Energy Evaluation Europe. And it's a community supporting the evaluation of both energy policy and programs in Asia Pacific. And of course, for energy, we've include both energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. And we hope to take a leadership role in expanding the practice of and capacity for what we call objective evaluation of these programs and policies. So we have several different mechanisms to foster a network of practitioners and stakeholders in this region. We do have a database of resources on international best practices in energy evaluation. We hold webinars such as this one. This is our 19th one. And then we've had conferences in the past. We hope to have another conference coming up. Let's see here. There. So our next webinar will be August 5th, and this will focus on non-energy impacts of energy. And we have two very good speakers. One, I know Bruce Tan for most of my career, so he brings a wealth of expertise. And then we'll have additional webinars in the coming months. And then we would like to hear from you about this webinar, and there's a form, and Nazir will talk about that one later. So today's webinar, we have two speakers. And the first one, Lorenzo, will talk about evaluation, measurement, and verification practices and key findings from a survey that he produced. And then Teevrat will then talk about demand response and looking at three different experiments, we'll call them, where they, in three different countries. So without giving away too much, I think I'll hand it over. Oh, no, I won't do that. Lorenzo, I was almost ready to hand it over to you. I will stop sharing my slides and you can get yours on, but I will introduce you while you do that. So Lorenzo is a senior consultant at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors, a Canadian firm advising clients across North America how to navigate and accelerate the energy transition. He co-leads the strategy cluster, focusing on clients' design strategies, plans, and roadmaps to navigate evolving contexts and determine and deliver on their priorities. Before that, he worked at a Universalia management group, doing related things. And he has a BA from Oxford and an MA from McGill University and an MBA from the Quantics School. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Lorenzo.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you to the Energy Evaluation Asia Pacific group for having me on today. So today, I'll be talking to you from Canada about North America. I know you're mostly in the Asia Pacific, but we hope this will still be interesting because of how it thinks about energy efficiency program evaluation in the context of the energy transition. So what we're presenting today is a project that we did for our client Hydro-Québec. Hydro-Québec is a large public utility in the province of Quebec in Canada, one of the largest utilities in North America. And Hydro-Québec basically asked us, how do we need to evolve our approach for evaluating energy efficiency and demand response programs in the context of the energy transition? The study was carried out between 2021 and 2023. And here I present some conclusions from us looking at best practices across North America. It doesn't represent their official views. One quick word before that about who we are. So I work at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors, a Canadian consultancy focused entirely on the energy transition. We've been around for 20 years, roughly 60 people, done over 1,000 projects in energy efficiency in buildings, electrified mobility, industry, and energy. And we've worked across North America, so all across Canada, all across the US for utilities, governments, corporates. So why revisit the role of energy efficiency program evaluation? So the role of evaluation, it hasn't changed much in 20 years. So it has historically been to evaluate, measure, and verify savings from energy efficiency programs, and therefore ensuring compliance with energy regulators' requirements that require utilities to evaluate their programs, because the utilities can sort of use the investments into programs to claim revenue from the regulator. However, at Hydro-Québec and elsewhere in North America, we see a changing context, so new targets in energy efficiency that are becoming more ambitious to limit growth of electricity demand, which is very rapid these days. At Hydro-Québec, there were some changes in structure. There were new types of programs and technologies emerging. and we saw just general evolution. So they asked us, can we think about the role of evaluation in this new context? They asked us to look specifically at 8 themes. So it's a lot here. I will just kind of basically name them quickly. We looked at how people plan and decide what and how much to evaluate, how they manage overlap between programs, for example, when there's programs by utilities and governments at the same time, how you use evaluations to foster learning and continuous improvement, how you structure evaluation teams within the organization, should they be close or far to program teams, how we evaluate not just energy savings, but greenhouse gas savings, how you evaluate the equity of programs and who they serve and who they finance. So for example, when you give subsidies for equipment, how you evaluate transforming whole markets in the not just individual sort of subsidies. And finally, MNV 2.0, monitoring and verification 2.0, which is kind of using new real-time technologies and AI. To look at what was happening in the space, we spoke to, we did over 24 interviews across North America. You see here on the right a little bit, it was utilities, consultants, regulators, and other actors across 8 different states and provinces. What we found, high level, if I summarize, is that if we look at all these 8 jurisdictions that we reviewed, 3 types of jurisdictions stand out, and we tried to group them to make it easier to read. And we distinguished between those that had more regulatory flexibility in terms of evaluation, what to do, how to do it, and those that had less. That's one axis here. And on the other axis, those that had very explicit climate ambitions to decarbonize and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or on the other hand, those that did not have such policy constraints. The 3 groups that we find is, on the one hand, what we call the holistic jurisdictions. So this includes more the West Coast, British Columbia, or the state of Oregon, the state of Washington on the West Coast of the United States. Those jurisdictions, they have a lot of flexibility in how they approach evaluation. They have quite a collaborative culture between utilities, regulators, consultants, and they have a lot of experience in market transformation, so evaluating the changes in a whole market rather than just the results of one program. So a very broad view. The second group is what we call the demanding group. This includes states more in the east, so Massachusetts, New York, the province of Quebec, where our client is, as well as California on the West Coast. Those states, they have quite aggressive climate and decarbonization goals, but they are subject to quite stringent regulatory requirements from the energy regulator as regards program evaluation. So how much they need to do it, how rigorous it is. And so they need a lot of very sort of fine-grained and detailed evaluation methodologies. Finally, the last group was what we call the traditionalists, so the jurisdictions that did not at the time of the study have very strong climate ambitions or sort of very advanced evaluation practices. So this includes Canadian jurisdictions here, New Brunswick and Ontario, 2 provinces in the east of Canada. One thing that we see is that for the group of the demanding jurisdictions, those that were the second out of 3 groups that I just presented, they face a tension. They face a tension between the regulatory stringency or demands that they get from the regulators. You have to evaluate all your programs, all the savings, very rigorous, and the climate ambition, which is that you need to go very fast. Energy efficiency is a great climate strategy because the best energy is the one that you never consume. So you need to do a lot of energy efficiency, but with a lot of actors and everyone's getting involved. And there's a tension between these 2 things because doing a lot of programs fast and evaluating them all very rigorously, the evaluation, there's a risk that maybe this slows you down or makes your programs less ambitious. I'm not saying that's always the case, but this was a perceived tension. And so we have some people that we interviewed that spoke about this tension. I'm not going to read them all out here. You have a couple of quotes. But for example, one person told us, you know, we spend all this money on counting beans, that is like evaluating all the programs, yet our goals get harder and harder. So maybe we should spend more money on achieving the goals and less on like measuring every little program and every saving in detail. This sort of this tension between the level of detail and checking everything versus actually rolling out and being very ambitious. So someone else said, we don't have time to overplan or evaluate. Our entire state is on fire. we need to move forward, and we need to accept a little less certainty in our evaluations. And someone finally, it is not possible to allocate everything and to measure everything. So this is basically the tension that we see. The other thing that based on this tension that we did is we basically tried to map what are the different approaches that jurisdictions take. And here on the left, what you see is the 8 categories of themes that we were looking at that I briefly presented earlier. And so for all of these, we divided them and we came up with a framework to say, okay, there's kind of conventional approaches on the one hand and more emerging novel approaches. So for example, for the first year, for 4 themes here, we distinguish between, on the one hand, there's kind of a paradigm where evaluation is perceived as basically an audit function. You need to strictly evaluate everything, be very precise. Learning is not as important as accountability. And in your organization, evaluation teams need to be really separate and strictly distinct from your program team so that they don't influence each other and accountability remains very strong. On the other hand, the more emerging paradigm is what we see a learning paradigm, where evaluation is more flexible. It is designed to inform learnings. It is done mostly when you need it, but not where you already have information. And it emphasizes collaboration to make it strong and more useful between program teams and evaluation teams. Similarly, on the second 4 themes here on the slide, greenhouse gases, equity, market transformation, and MNV 2.0, which is basically AI and new technologies. We differentiated between classic approaches, which basically did not look at any of these, and more emerging approaches, which do consider all of these technologies. And what you will see is basically that we mapped all of the jurisdictions we looked at across all of these areas. Now, these were positions in 2022 when we did the study, so things may have evolved, but that was at the time our assessment. And so we see that different jurisdictions are at different places. Some are more in the emerging paradigm, some are still quite conventional. It so turns out that Quebec, which was our client, Hydro-Québec, was still more conventional, which is why they were interested in seeing what the others were doing. And on some places as well, like GHGs and equity, we found that no one was really fully considering them yet. So this was kind of still a bit of an empty space in terms of emerging methodologies. I mean, I'm sure there are leaders, but at the time, no one had kind of fully incorporated this into evaluation roles, and maybe there are good reasons not to do so. So this is a little bit an overview of the landscape we saw of practices of evaluation. Then the ask was, okay, so what to do now? What is the recommendation for an approach to evaluation that does align and does work for the energy transition? And basically here we propose a framework for what we call a transition aligned evaluation function, which has a new North Star and builds around 2 pillars. So the North Star is decarbonization, which is the new sort of, in certain contexts and geographies, and certainly in Quebec, is mandated by the government, so it is a priority. Electrification of the economy, which goes along with it, and energy efficiency, which obviously has always been at the heart of energy efficiency programs. So this is the new North Star, and not just accountability, which maybe was the past North Star. Still, rigorous and credible evaluation is still there and is still very important. So it's not to throw rigor out the window, it remains important. The 2 pillars, though, to modify the approach maybe and make it evolve, is on the one hand, adopting what we call a learning orientation. So focusing on evaluations on what is useful and focusing them on helping to support transition objectives and helping deliver overall transition goals. So maybe not always focusing just on the small program, but always in the context of, does this support the overall energy transition? The other one is what we call adding strings to one's bow. So basically adding methodologies and looking maybe a little beyond traditional energy savings. So that allows evaluation to measure not just energy savings, but new sources of value that programs generate, like non-energy benefits, greenhouse gas savings, equity outcomes, for example, when subsidies support low-income families with getting better air, AC. And for each of these 2 areas, along our 8 themes, we basically gave recommendations to right-size the evaluation effort and maybe not aim to evaluate everything, but evaluate what's most important and where you need the most information to adjust your programs. To focus more on enabling learning and program improvement, so by collaborating between program teams and evaluation teams. To expand the scope of evaluation to include equity and market transformation and greenhouse gases, and to measure more in real time using new and emerging technologies known as M&V 2.0. Now, some people might say, and I'm almost done, I'm getting to the end here, can this actually work? You know, what are there not big risks to maybe focusing more on learning than on accountability and focusing on new value streams rather than on energy savings exclusively? The perspective we're putting forward is that the benefits of changing, they exceed the costs of stagnating, of retaining the same methodologies we've had for the last 2 decades, broadly speaking. And granted, this is again a North American context, but to the extent that this may be of interest, basically what we see is that, you know, the perceived risks of changing, of course, is, people might be worried we're going to lose precision, we're going to overestimate savings if we're not so precise in our evaluations, and we're going to just believe what utilities claim that they have saved. We're going to lose independence and lose credibility. To mitigate those risks, basically, what we're proposing is evaluation will continue for most programs. It will still be there in most cases, maybe not every program, maybe not as regularly. If the program hasn't changed, we don't need to evaluate it again 3 years later, or if the market hasn't changed. But so it will continue. There will be safeguards to ensure quality. So the evaluations might still be done by external consultants, not by utilities themselves. So there's still some independence. What we actually see, these proposed practices, they work in other jurisdictions. So this is not something completely new or invented. We have seen it at work. As you saw, many places have these emerging practices. And finally, one big concern in energy efficiency programming is that when you give out subsidies, you have a free ridership, but here I call opportunism. That's kind of more francophone word, but free ridership basically, because those who will adopt subsidies would have maybe adopted the technology anyway, and now they're just taking the money. We think as the energy transition accelerates and you need to be much faster in technology rollover, free ridership will drop, because right now programs just target the slim margin of early adopters. But in the energy transition, everyone needs to switch technology over the course of 1 or 2 decades. And therefore, the free riders, those who would have done it anyway, become a much smaller share of the people targeted in your program. So free ridership becomes a much smaller concern as the energy transition accelerates than it has been historically in energy efficiency programs. So this also reduces the level of risk. And then not changing, what are the risks of actually remaining the same? You risk slowing down and complicating the scaling up of energy efficiency and demand response efforts. You risk falling into what are the people we interviewed called false precision. You think you're being super detailed in your evaluation methodologies and measuring everything, but it's not actually possible to say what would have happened in the world if the program didn't exist, because these are very complex interventions in the social world. You also risk focusing too much on small trees and not on the forest, on the big picture, and missing opportunities for improving programs because you spend all that time sort of measuring every single outcome of them. So broadly speaking, this is it, and I am at my 15 minutes. So thank you very much for this, and of course I'll be available for any questions and answers, and I realize it was a lot of information.
Thank you very much. This is great. As we noted at the beginning, at the end of this, we'll have time for questions. At the same time, in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, you can put in your questions there, and we'll try to have time for that. Before I do go on, I'll take the advantage here of, when I think about evaluation and who's the supporter, ideally you'd like it at the CEO level, and the CEO saying, yeah, evaluation important. I want everyone below me to focus on that. Another model is in each of the key departments, there's an evaluation function, a person in charge of evaluation at each of the major areas of activity. And then I guess the third one is there's just one group responsible for evaluation in the whole organization. Have you come across any models that you think is the right way to proceed, or actually not right way to proceed, but that where you have seen it actually in practice that looks good?
So this is a question for me, I take it.
Yes, this is for you.
That is. Okay, so two things. We did see different models, so organizations where evaluation teams and program teams were really embedded, crossover, and maybe specific to each programs. And we saw them where they were super separate, programs on one side, evaluation at the other end. One thing we realized is culture is just as important as structure. So yes, having them structurally embedded can be helpful in terms of communication exchanges, knowing what's going on. But what people told us is that there needs to be a real culture of collaboration and a shared understanding of what programs in evaluation are for and their mutual benefits. Otherwise, you can sit them right next to each other and they will still not work. There will be a lack of trust and a lack of collaboration. So yeah, we saw different approaches. What we are favoring overall here is recommending more proximity and collaboration. We think this favors the sort of learning and efficiencies as well. However, that alone will not do it. There needs to be also sort of from leadership downwards, a shared understanding and a culture of collaboration.
Okay, good. Now we will proceed with our second speaker, Teevrat. He's an associate professor of economics at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California at San Diego. He specializes in research on decarbonization, energy transitions, air quality, and climate adaptation. He's published a lot. His work combines rigorous empirical methods, such as randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental designs, with close partnerships with governments and NGOs to generate evidence that informs real-world policy. I think I'll stop here. There's more, and you can read, we sent out more info about him in the intro to this webinar. So I'll hand it over to Teevrat.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me. What I'm going to talk about today is try to give you a sense of 3 different case studies that use randomized control trials in order to be able to uncover certain key parameters that are important for how we think about proceeding with decarbonization policy in the energy sector. So just as a quick primer, I think this is not huge news for anybody in the room, but just to state the obvious, there's a massive increase in energy demand that's expected to come in the next few decades, and most of that is going to happen in emerging economies, and that's for a number of reasons, including the fact that there are non-linearities and convexities in how people adopt energy-using appliances, and a lot of these countries are now just at the precipice of where that non-convexity comes in. So the pace at which the energy-using appliance adoption is going to increase is going to be quite rapid. And especially in the context of a country like India, but this is true for many other countries in South and Southeast Asia. I do a lot of work in India. The chunk of this is going to come from AC adoption. I think India is expected to have AC adoption increase by 4x in the next 25 years. And this creates grid instability, which is a cross-cutting problem. You need ACs for climate adaptation, but at the same time, there's a ton of conventional energy being used, including through coal-fired power plants, that results in both global carbon emissions, but also in terms of local air pollution emergencies. And then it just poses in general like a geopolitical consideration for a lot of these countries in terms of their energy security. And so to give you a sense of like how the magnitude of this problem, this isn't just a problem that's going to look similar to the ones that a lot of OECD countries have faced. But if you look at this really excellent paper by Kaleli et al. In Scientific Reports, it shows that the peak demand responses in India relative to, say, Europe under different levels of AC penetration are going to be actually quite massive. And that's because of both temperature exposure. It's also going to be because of the population that's going to be utilizing this. But then finally, it's just going to come from the fact that the grid infrastructure itself is not set up currently to meet this demand. So within this context, there's a business case for demand management to occur, which is that peak electricity is often sold at a loss, and the demand management can yield a lot of fiscal savings for utilities. In low and middle income countries, a lot of these utilities tend to be state-owned, and they have many arrears on their losses that stop them from investing in further infrastructure development and further service delivery that in turn creates this vicious cycle. And so demand management can be used to at least ameliorate some of that. Grid stability is another important advantage because it avoids the rationing of electricity through blackouts or overloading infrastructure. And I think this is going to become even more important in a world where more and more solar is coming on, and we're going to be dealing with curtailment costs, which is something that some of the utilities in India are already facing, for example, and so are the ones in Vietnam. And finally, peak electricity just has the highest carbon and particulate matter footprint, so there's sort of a social case to be made for sustainability here. So let me jump in first with our study in Vietnam. The problem here was that in Hanoi, Vietnam, most of the electricity, is the core base is coming from hydro. So the demand response need isn't so much within the day, but rather sort of day to day, week to week. And the utility wants to incentivize peak demand reduction, which is generally July and August of any given year. And so what we did was we came in with them and we worked with them to see if we can use first principles economics to improve the payout, improve the rate of efficiency in some of their existing demand response programs. So what they were doing was essentially giving households a payout at the end of the summer if they were able to reduce their energy use by a certain percentage. What we realize is that there's strong economic theory and in other contexts, experimental evidence that suggests that actually one better way to design contracts might be to make them relative contracts rather than absolute contracts. Essentially, you're creating a contest. And the idea here is that, let's say it was a very, very hot summer and you set everybody on a benchmark for 10%, no one's going to be able to meet that. And so you're not going to actually get any demand response. Similarly, if it was too cold of a summer, it was too mild, everyone's going to meet that threshold without actually putting in effort. And so in that world, your demand response program actually has a very low return on investment. Whereas if you were in a contest world, you put households in groups of 50 with the winners getting a prize, even if it's a very warm or even if it's a very hot, cool summer, you still have an incentive to engage in energy conservation. And what that does is it creates a nice return on investment for these households. So what we did was we ran a randomized control trial with about 12,000 households, and we randomized them into contracts and contests. There's a whole paper on this, and which I won't have time to get into, but essentially we looked at what were the effects of these treatments and what the return on investment was in terms of dollar spent by the utility. And so what we showed was, first of all, I think we were able to achieve 7 to 9% energy reduction during peak summer months, which is really fascinating because it's it is possible to achieve large levels of energy reduction in the times that you do actually want it. This is exactly in the time period when the utility was looking for it. And we importantly were able to show here that there was no rebounding. It wasn't that you made these gains and then you lost those gains in the weeks that followed. If anything, energy reduction came just below where it used to be, which is, and we were only incentivizing them for that 1 month period. So this makes good sense. So our insights that are scalable from this was that we were able to show that you are able to get this really high energy reduction. Most of the nudge and the nudge literature shows it's about a 0.5, 0.7% effect. We were able to get 7 to 9% effect. The carbon reductions here were that were additional, were coming at a fairly low cost, and in fact they were negative. The cost was negative when the marginal abatement source was oil, because that's was being sold at 26. That's procured at 26 cents per kilowatt hour and only sold at about 9 cents per kilowatt hour. And finally, what the key message here was that even though we got the same reduction, contests were able to deliver this at half the budget, and so they were twice as cost effective. And they had this added advantage of having a fixed, stable budget, meaning that utilities didn't have to over or under budget because there was a fixed payout at the end of the year. And so this was an example of where the utility gave us a problem and we were able to improve the cost effectiveness. We were able to double the cost effectiveness of their existing demand response program. Of course, this was all in a setting where we are asking people to make active behavior change. And so what we're doing in India, which is powered by our social enterprise called Power Technologies, which stands for Power Demand Response, we realized that here the problem is very much that most of the demand response programs are asking people to make an active change. The one exception to this is when people have smart thermostats in HVAC systems, and that allows utilities to do this in an automated manner. Now, of course, in most low and middle income countries, including in India, HVAC systems are virtually non-existent in residential and even in higher income residential settings. And there's a lot of holdover of older technologies. And so what our solution here was to, essentially, how can we take these existing technologies and without adding too much expense on the burden of the household to, somehow invest in smart technologies, how can we convert these existing dumb appliances into smart appliances and bring them into a virtual power plant? And so our solution here is to use low-cost smart technologies like smart switches and smart plugs that are essentially a little socket that goes between the wall, the wall outlet and your appliance. It's connected to Wi-Fi, and depending on the contract that you sign with the household, you can bring them into this virtual power plant that then is able to use an algorithm that optimizes across demand and supply in order to create short bursts of switch-off events in order to balance out the grid. And so in the base study that some people in our team did was we essentially signed a contract with households and said, we're going to give you no more than 2 events per day, no more than 8 events per week, and this is going to be about a half-hour switch-off, and we default households into it once they've signed a contract. They can easily override this using an app that we've created or by pressing a button on the smart plug. So they have full control over it, but we sort of default them into this exercise. And the advantage here is that we're able to work with existing appliances rather than having them invest in new appliances, which is of course a big barrier. And these are the older appliances are the ones that end up using a lot more energy. So we did a couple of different experimental arms, and basically what we showed was that we were able to get a 60% reduction in energy use at the appliance level. And this was kind of invariant to how much notice we gave households or what their reward rate was. And this is quite insightful because it means that just this default in behavior rather than some kind of price incentive was driving these households into engaging in energy conservation at exactly the right time. And it didn't require them to actually do any active behavior change. Because we were working with households that also had smart meter data, we're able to look at not just the appliance level effects, but also the household level effects, which is, if I just turned off your AC in one room, did you just go to a different room and turn on that AC? And we're able to show that actually that wasn't the case. Almost entirely the device level reductions correspond to household level reductions, which means that these are in fact additional reductions that are happening in exactly the time that you need. We can put this alongside where the grid is. And one of the great things about this study is that the team was able to show that we're able to get reductions at exactly the times when you need it in the grid. So this isn't just reductions at different times of the day, but it's the reductions when you exactly need them in order to stabilize the grid. And again, when we translate this into emissions, you get that most of the emissions, the net mitigation costs are actually negative. It's very much just at the tail end that you end up getting positive emissions reductions costs, which of course means that the ROI here is infinite. Our company here, our social enterprise here at Power Technologies is scaling this up across a number of different utilities with a 20,000 household target by 2026. And we're going to be doing experimental learning as we're proceeding on for this. If anybody's interested in chatting more about this, I'm happy to do that. And then finally in San Diego, working with a nice big team at the Deep Decarbonization Initiative, we're trying to understand the problem of how do we get people to start charging at the workplace. Charging at the workplace in solar dominated grids is actually quite important because that's when you have most of the clean, free, low marginal cost energy being generated. But if, almost all of the early adopters of electric vehicles were richer people who also had charging options at home. So they were charging at night when the emissions factors are considerably higher. We did a back of the envelope calculation to show that actually if you charge at night versus charging in the day, the emissions factor is 4x, and that's because of the composition of where the grid is at that time of the day. This is a nice image that sort of shows you, what California, for instance, the California vision for 2030 is and what the current campus charging infrastructure looks like. And the ability to translate one into the other is going to require a lot of understanding of how we can make behavior change happen. And so we're able to create this largest ever randomized controlled trial involving EV charging. And we do this in a single workplace that's able to then translate, like we're able to measure like every aspect of what people are doing. And what that lets us do is understand like why they're responding to certain nudges or certain financial incentives. What we ended up finding was that actually like price discounts here sort of backfired because it gave people the illusion that this was going to be a very congested day or a very congested moment. And because your charging infrastructure and your parking infrastructure are bundled, it gave people the appearance that the parking infrastructure was going to be scarce. And so it actually generated perverse behavior in initiating earlier in the day against solar hour charging, whereas environmental nudges worked very clearly in delivering the message that this is when charging is most effective. And that was actually much more beneficial than getting people to charge alongside solar hours. Both were very good at bringing people to campus to charge in the first place, but of course it created, if you misalign some of these financial incentives, as Lorenzo was discussing, you end up getting you may end up getting perverse results. So the takeaway from all of these three instances was, we're working with utilities and we're working with companies to design their demand response programs. The gains here are quite large, at least in terms of relative to their investment, and a few tweaks and a few like plumbing exercises almost with how these incentives are designed, how these programs are designed, can magnify the return on investment. It's a really exciting opportunity to both study human behavior and deliver policy change. So I'll stop there and thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you very much. That was very interesting. As I said earlier, feel free to ask questions now or put it in the chat. But for those who are on, do you have any questions first for Teevrat? And I'm going to look at the chat while we wait here. Okay, let's see. Okay, I have one. I'll go. This is all great stuff that I personally been interested in for many years. And I was interested in whether you looked at the breakdown of the different groups. So you have, for each of the three experiments, say high energy, let's say energy savers, medium energy savers, low energy savers, or no energy savers. And then did you look at the demographics, and is there any consistency in the three studies saying, and not knowing what data you collected, but if you collected education as one type of information, people without a high school degree versus a college degree versus postgraduate, or income, which is sometimes more sensitive, but people with low income, medium, et cetera, are there, I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. Are there any sort of demographic attributes that then in the next phase of the research, you can focus on that and tailor your messages to those people?
Yeah, I think the short answer to your question is that we're sort of targeting a very, typically like your traditional conventional demand response programs, because of the technology requirements that have come in with it, have been geared towards higher income households, and the returns and to some extent, I guess the gains from some of those programs have been quite limited, and in part because you think about the higher income household you are, like the higher your energy consumption is, the less price sensitive you are, and so to use like price mechanisms in order to generate that sensitivity, it's going to be quite low. You're thinking about super low energy consumers, like really poor people. There's not really much of a point there either, because the amount of reduction that you're going to get is quite low, and the marginal value of that electricity is quite high to them, right? And so the amount of money that you would need relative to the gains you're getting are going to be small. So it's the middle segment, which is in fact the largest segment of energy users. And so in Vietnam, for instance, we limited ourselves to people who were in that middle bucket of energy use. And there, I think you're going to see that most of the things that explain why a particular household engages in energy conservation are actually like household specific attributes and day specific attributes, right? So at the end of the day, it's like important to remember that like people aren't tracking their energy use and tracking their energy bill like by the minute, by the hour, right? Like they're living their lives, they're going about it. And so this is where sort of these broad programs that are able to incentivize properly the people who have the lowest abatement costs to align alongside your incentives, I think is quite important. And this is also where our experiment in India provided a lot of really key insights around the need for automation and the need for defaulting people in. People are happy to participate this in the one time they're thinking about that decision, but if they're having to do this on a daily basis, nobody has that kind of like, very few people have that kind of like patience, energy, and attention in order to be able to engage in conservation. So that's where I think that some combination of like cleverly designed incentives alongside default bias and using low cost technologies and sensors that are more and more available, I think is probably the way forward here.
Let me just follow up on that. As an economist, you're focusing on prices. How about non-price reasons for participation? Did you look at that, or is that part of any of these different programs? And going forward, could that be introduced? Because, you know, in our experience, price is very important, no question about it. But there are these non-price factors that influence people's behavior.
Absolutely. So, you know, in Vietnam, for instance, we gave everybody a social message that was like, hey, you know, this is going to be a rough summer for the utility. Please try to conserve energy as much as possible. So any of the effects that you're seeing on net of those nudges. Now, it's worth noting out that like nudges have been like extremely studied. Like there's, you know, O-Power has done years of studies on this, including other utilities as well. And the general like sense, at least my read of the literature, is that the effect there is about a 0.5 to 0.7% reduction. It's very, very cost effective because nudges are cheap. You're not paying anybody anything. You're just sending them text messages or push notifications on their app. So it is very, very cost effective and should be done. But the aggregate amount of like demand response that you're getting is actually relatively quite small. So when you're thinking about like high fluctuations because of weather or because of like, you know, the inability of hydro to provide, or prices are spiking up, you're not going to get the large like 7 to 9% reduction that you need from that kind of behavioral response. Having said that, you should still do that, because that is where like that is the most cost effective thing to do. You're just not going to be able to scale that up in terms of magnitude of reductions.
Okay. We do have a question from Tilak. Do you know whether any utility anywhere in the world actually practicing this type of demand response beyond the research level work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the way the Vietnam example, for instance, is one where this was a utility program that we helped add on and change and modify in order to deliver better reductions. We're doing one confirmatory trial next summer, and after that, like the plan is to scale that up nationally. But you know, in many of the OECD countries, including here in California, most of the utilities have like some kind of demand response program where they'll say, hey, if you give me, you know, control of your HVAC thermostat for a few hours every day, or a few days of the summer when it's the highest energy, you know, and you comply with this program, we'll send you a gift card or something. There are different designs, you know, most of them are these bilateral contracts where you agree to a certain amount of reduction or agree to a certain amount of behavior, and then you get energy compensation. But yeah, these are quite ubiquitous now, these demand response programs.
Okay. I'd like to go back to Lorenzo. Romeo had to leave early, but he'll listen to this, I know, knowing Romeo. So can you please give us some nuanced ideas about what accurate evaluation means, or how it is used in the context of your industry? Say is there a set of criteria being applied, components of evaluation, specific methodologies used, etc.? You sort of get the flavor of his question.
Certainly. So I spoke a little bit about how exactly the trade-off between sort of maybe accuracy on the need for accuracy on the one hand, and scale on the other. One thing we came across that helps to imagine it a little bit is guidance from, I think I can actually post it in the chat here, from basically the New York State Department of Public Services, which provides guidance for energy efficiency program evaluation. And they differentiate what it is to apply sort of a low, moderate, or high level of rigor and accuracy to an evaluation. So for example, they say the lowest rigor would be you verify just the sample of the measures and you do some billing analysis, but you don't necessarily meter in real time the savings. You know, a moderate level maybe is where you do verify a larger sample or all of it, but you're still billing. And then the highest rigor is where you meter everything and verify all of these savings. So it's a little bit about how much of the savings and measures you cover. So it's in terms of scope, it's a little bit of what data source you use, whether it's billing or real-time meter data. It's a little bit about, you know, are you also going to call and interview every participant in the program? So what the level of effort you put in. And basically, what we liked about the guidance that New York gave is they said, well, you should adjust your level of rigor and accuracy depending on the program type and on your expectations. So if it's a new program with very high uncertainty and you don't know how it's going to go, then maybe a higher level of rigor and effort is appropriate. If it's a very established program, then a lower level of rigor would be fine because you already know it. Maybe the market hasn't changed so much. Similarly, if you have like a low expected amount of savings, you're not going to save that much overall. Maybe it's not worth spending a ton of effort evaluating those savings because maybe it's quite a small program, unless it's a pilot, right, or an RCT, like Teevrat presented, where it's very important to know what's going to come out of it to scale it up. But if it's sort of an established but small program, maybe less important. If it's a really large program, again, it's worth obviously investing more. So that was a little bit what we liked, is adjusting the effort to the use and what you'll expect to get out of it. Why we put that forward is because we still see jurisdictions such as Quebec at the time of the evaluation, where the energy regulator had very undifferentiated expectations for the level of effort for an evaluation. Like you have a program, independently of any considerations, you just need to be super complete and rigorous and exhaustive in evaluating it. And that creates sort of a lot of cost for the utility in a context where they need to multiply and scale up a lot of programs. Hence, we thought the New York approach is just one example of at least having a basic matrix and right fitting that rigor or accuracy was interesting. So I hope that kind of responds, and I put the image in the chat as well.
That was good, but I will follow up with one other question related to that, because a lot more. Let's use numbers. So, I mean, it's a common question over 40 years of work. What % of my program budget should go to evaluation? Some people say 6%, maybe 3%, or 1%. And I know based on your last response, it will vary. Is this a traditional program that's been going on for like 5 years, or is this a new program? But I wonder if you've come across, based on your work, on what people were recommending.
So I think we did not explicitly sort of review full budget amounts. One thing I can maybe comment on is we looked at, for example.
Yeah, you can answer with that just based on your knowledge, okay, not on the actual study. So yeah.
Fair enough, but so it does vary. I think in terms it's in the sort of often in the low percentage points. So I'd say around the 5% mark is what I've sometimes seen. But what I can comment on more confidently maybe is, well, and one thing we looked at the time was how much, how often, like what percentage of programs you actually need to evaluate and on what frequency. Because there were some places that basically said you need to at least produce some evaluation or verification of your program every year for all of your programs. That was quite a burden, but maybe it's appropriate for new or rapidly evolving programs. And then there were places that either let the utility sort of propose themselves what they thought was the most interesting programs to review, or that were a bit more relaxed. So said, you need to evaluate all of your programs on a 5-6 year cycle. So then you have a lot more flexibility of when to evaluate and how to sort of structure and order it. So it doesn't fully get. I'm going to try and see if I can find in the next couple of minutes a little bit more info on the budgets. And I think we had something about it somewhere, but this at least covers a little bit the intensity and frequency of evaluations, which varied.
Okay. While you do that, we're approaching the end of the hour. There is one question that just came in, and we'll try to see if Teevrat can answer that. What's the potential impact of implementing demand response programs through strict policy enforcement rather than relying on voluntary behavior-based approaches? Good question. Let's hear a good answer.
I think it's a good question. I think it's worth pointing out that one of the reasons we have demand response programs is because electricity is mispriced in the first place, right? That I think that in an ideal world, like if you had an economist dream come true, then every minute you'd have like, electricity price in the wholesale market, there'd be a markup for the utility for infrastructure, whatever the fixed cost recovery is, and then you'd have, the prices be changing. But for various good reasons, electricity prices are heavily regulated. They're natural monopolies. You want to protect consumers. You worry about attention span of consumers to dynamic pricing, for instance, et cetera. And so because of that, like there are times of the day when electricity is heavily mispriced. And so in those moments, like what you're doing is essentially like trying to incentivize behavior change. Now, there is strict policy enforcement of demand response. It's just called blackouts, right? Like when the utilities are trying to enforce like demand reductions, the way they enforce demand reductions is by having blackouts. And that's because they can't have supply meet demand, or the supply is coming at too expensive of a price in the wholesale market. So that's where I think it comes in. I think we sort of agreed that the strict policy enforcement of demand reduction through blackouts, et cetera, is just not as desirable. And if you do force people into blackouts, it creates all these other perverse incentives, which are you buy generators which are less energy efficient and more polluting. And so, you're beating back all of these policy objectives that you would have anyway. So that's why, figuring out the right incentives that most cost effectively, get people to engage in behavior that you want them to, I think is where the interesting challenge is.
Good. Thank you. Lorenzo, you may have the last answer. If not, we can add it later. Did you find a number you like?
I just put it in the chat, yes. So what we found at the time was in the US, it was 5 to 6% of program budgets that went to evaluation. And in Canada, it was a bit less at the time, 3%. So this may have changed since. And obviously some places invested more or less. One place was as low as 1%. So this is what we saw in terms of what we recommend. I think I can't sort of express myself firmly here, but it's at least a little bit the range that we saw.
Great, thank you. I want to thank both Lorenzo and Teevrat for great presentations today. I'm going to hand it over to Nazir, who will end this.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you, Lorenzo and Teevrat, for the very insightful discussion. We found it really insightful. Thanks to all the participants for making the webinar more engaging. I have put this short link in the chat box. It would be great to hear your feedback and suggestions. And if you would like to be part of future webinars as speakers, you can also reach out to us. You can follow us on X, previous Twitter. We are active there, but we are also more active on LinkedIn. You can follow the community to follow the activities that we organize, but also to be part of the discussion that happens in the page. You can find recordings of the previous webinars on our YouTube channel and as well as on our website. The website section, the resource section of the website also includes summary notes of the previous webinars and as well as slides from the previous webinars. Thank you everyone again for joining us. Wish you all a good day and good night to folks in the Asia Pacific region. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.